Hello.
Hello, 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 hello.
Hello.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Right.
It's snowing here. It's really pretty.
I heard it was snowing in Seattle.
It is snowing in Seattle. Doesn't happen all the time. So
Okay. I have enabled screen sharing, on the
received.
offhand possibility that somebody may have brought a deck today.
Oh yeah. Got stuff to show.
Just in case.
Hey Jeremy.
How's it going?
Good. I will just preemptively start sharing my screen. Let me know when you actually want to start. I don't know if you're awkwardly waiting for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were about to do it.
Sorry.
I think we can
Oh
go.
God.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Free after. This is the normal time.
Okay, good. Well, then I'll steal the thunder of P. Maury's usual spiel, which is hello and welcome to SIG Multicluster on Tuesday, November 29th. Laura, you have the floor. Okay, now it's my turn, which is I'm going to talk a little bit about some efforts to improve the SIG multicluster contributor experience. So I mentioned this in Slack some time ago. I forget exactly when, but so I guess it was a little bit after our last meeting, but there's this doc here, SIG MC website proposal I have pulled up over here, which is basically consolidating the ideas we had talked about at KubeCon North America and then in last SIG MC meeting about giving some more discoverability to some of SIG Multicluster's projects. And also just overall make it easier for people to know what is going on from the outside and also how to contribute. So fundamentally, this is all based on gateway APIs efforts in the same type of way. So I'm just going to click through to here to remind everybody that Gateway API has this website that introduces the Gateway API and has some documentation. It has lots of updates about when they meet and how they meet and what the process is to update the Gateway API. And yeah, so this proposal here, there's more details in here, but the TLDR is to take a lot of inspiration from that, certainly in terms of development and logistics, but actually unify all information on SIG multicluster subprojects. So instead of being just about one of the APIs or just having each of the APIs host their own version of this site, that at least the high level documentation is all unified together. This doesn't necessarily replace actual individual API documentation and whatever. Certainly not API reference documentation, but more that high level thing that people can first get a hold of. And we have talked with the Gateway API maintainers to learn more about how they set theirs up. So logistically, there's a like a skeleton proposal and just in a personal repo and an example deployment there as well. Though I'm going to show you some changes that Nicholas has made in a few minutes. And fundamentally, it's based on this framework that the Gateway API uses, the Gateway API site uses. And this is the docs that I'm thinking need to be here. So like the big overview of the SIG, like stuff kind of like that's in the charter, but also what's in like some of the KubeCon slides and discussions about the roadmap in SIG MC. Again, that high level documentation on sub projects with really basic use cases. Some aggregated status information and links out to implementations of sub projects. So this could be a consolidated place where like the different MCS API implementations or different work API implementations can be referred to so people know where they are and what stage they're in. Some contributing guidelines about the SIG generally, like what's normal regarding like adding stuff to the agenda, or like what do we think is a valid project for us to work on, and potentially aggregate some API documentation from the sub projects. I'm not super tied to this one, but it seems like a possibility. So that's the overall idea. And again, this link here goes to like a really bare bones, like straight up just what the first make docs like in it basically makes. But Nicholas has been working on more content. It has a PR out for that. So this is kind of like an initial stab at introducing more details about all of our concepts, guides, places where we can put individual implementations, more contributing info. So Nicholas, I don't want to steal your thunder because you did all of this. Do you want to talk? Do you want to talk a little bit about this or the process or anything?
Sure. Yeah. So there's still a bit of work in there because as Laura mentioned, I took a lot of examples from the Gateway API docs. So there are, like the contribution stuff is really a rip and replace basically on the. It's basically modifying a few things basically to match the SIG multi-cluster stuff. There are a few things to fix, like getting a proper calendar and things like that. And what I did actually is, as I'm new on the project, I actually had I put a bit of time on listening to the old videos and getting some ideas and stuff like that. So there's there's obviously the cluster set, service export, service import stuff. There's also this notion of about API and multi-cluster services API and work API somehow. So I've not settled yet on a model, but I try basically to gather as much as information, and it's not finished yet, right? And there's still the implementation stuff basically, but it's basically a work in progress, and this is just the latest and greatest that I put together for today, basically.
Awesome.
This is awesome.
I think it looks great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Nice. And I see Mike is in the call. Definitely need some work API. What's the word? Specialist domain experts. So
Yep, I'm gonna contribute. Maybe I'll contribute to Nicholas' branch with the work API contents.
cool. Yeah. Let me also maybe just speak a little bit to kind of order of operations here on like where this repo will live. So right now, I just made like this proposal one so that we could see, how it was made, and Nicholas made a fork to work on his stuff too. But I did open a request to make like an official repo and Kubernetes SIGs for the site. So I think ultimately at some point it will be, if everybody is cool with this and this is fine, and unless anybody has any complaints about that process, then we would migrate whatever the final repo is over there. Just FYI that it could move. So yeah.
Ack.
Okay, great. Cool. Well, I will mention there were some alternatives considered down here with pros and cons of not doing it this way. So if you want to take a look at those and be like, no, this other one is a better idea. Like I think there's some variations in whether it's best to have like one site for everything in SIG-MC, for sub-projects to have their own, like Gateway API project fundamentally is, if all of this should just be in like the KK docs, if all of this should be in the Kubernetes.dev docs, questions like that. So if people were having worries about that, please take a look at that section and let me know if you still super disagree. So yeah, that's that.
All right, that's that. Was that
That's
all
that.
of your agenda item?
Yeah, I think that was all of my agenda item. Yes, but Stephen wants to talk about conformance tests.
Yes, he does. Go ahead, Stan.
Thank you. So I'll take over the screen share maybe.
Go for it.
Thanks. Right, so I took a look at following the last call, I took a look at the end-to-end tests in the MCS API repo with two goals in mind. One was to see what the conformance tests look like, and the other was to see whether Submariner passes them. And so this raised a few things. So I opened, an issue and some pull requests, and I thought it would be worth bringing them up in the call. So the first one that surprised me a little bit, because this is the first hurdle that Submariner ran into, is that the test is entirely based around service imports and endpoint slices. Well, the current test, and it doesn't create a service export, whereas Submariner takes the view, interprets the MCS API as saying that the service export is where everything starts. So I opened this issue for clarification on that point. Does it make sense to have a service import without a corresponding service export first?
Yeah, so I only responded in Slack, but I feel that these should start from the service export. And I don't know, Jeremy and Paul, if you want to talk about any of the legacy of these end-to-end tests, if they were like explicit on this point, but that's how I also I interpret
Yes.
the cap and everything the same as Stephen.
Yeah, no, they should definitely start with the service export. The tests that were there originally were not meant to be conformance tests. There was never an implementation of MCS, right? There was a hacky tool that would make it easy to implement in a way that kubeproxy could understand by auto creating services to align with any service imports and endpoint slices you created, more as a convenience, so that if you ran that tool, you could conceivably create a bash MCS controller. But this was never really meant to be like a full implementation. I think, yeah, I 100% agree for conformance tests. We should start at the service export. I think it's probably worth breaking down, if each step along the way, but I don't think we should be creating service imports. That's the implementation's job, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So what's the desired behavior of the test in this case? Is it to create a service export first and then expect the service import to be created?
Yeah, well, so that was my next point, which is that there's so Laura opened this issue a few months ago to turn the end-to-end tests into an actual conformance test, and so we need to figure out what should be covered. And so yeah, so just if we maybe take a look at what's currently in the test.
Yeah, and just one thing I'll also mention is that the issues that I've opened are based on what the KEP said the end-to-end test should cover. And if there's any difference between that and what we think conformance test should cover, that has not been analyzed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's, yeah, one of the things maybe we can discuss now, or perhaps we need to leave time for people to think about it. But anyway, so what's in the test currently is this. So there's hello service and the hello service import deployment that goes with it, and a request pod that's used to run a test. And the connectivity test does a bunch of setup. So there's a pile of things in the before each. It creates a namespace on both clusters. So then we get the namespace sameness idea. Creates the pods, the deployment service, and there it creates the service import, and then it expects
Yeah, down in
to
like
get the
190.
request pod. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here, and then yeah, still looking for pods, and then this is the interesting part. It expects the no, still not.
Yeah, I
That's
think
the pods.
195 is.
Yeah, this is the place where there's an actual MCS test. It looks for the endpoint slices that should have been created as a result of the service imports,
And
assuming
then
that this comes from service ports.
Yeah, and then even farther down, there's like a TCP connects and
Yeah.
somewhere,
Then
yeah.
there's the actual tests.
Right, because those aren't even like,
Test.
yeah, before, even though
Yeah.
it's checking for endpoint slices, that's actually not encapsulated in like a test
No, it's just part of the setup.
part of the setup.
Yeah.
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 Um,
So it's fairly basic. Well, like you said, Jeremy, it's not really intended. But when I was reading it, I got the impression it was more intended as sort of tool to help development of the spec.
Yeah. That's correct. So I think we probably need a separate test suite to create service exports and then validate that eventually the correct imports and endpoint slices are created. I think along with that, there's probably need to test the various service protocols that you can, expose ports and that they get, that you can actually connect to the pods on the other end. I think that's part of a conformant implementation. Like obviously, if you create the endpoints but they don't work, that's not helpful. But I would definitely look at it from the end user perspective, and I would expect that the tests basically test the behaviors that you as someone just consuming an implementation would use. So you create an export, and then sometime later your pods can talk to each other.
Yep. Yeah.
Looks like Paul has
And
something.
probably a bunch of DNS tests as well.
Yeah, I agree with what was said. I have two things. One is that like I wanted to make sure that I explicitly said I like the idea of like let's build out a new conformance suite instead of thinking about like mutating existing tests because they kind of have like a different goal than conformance in the older ones. And the other thing that we haven't talked about is these tests are like the simplest working EDE that you could make, right? You have to have at least 2 clusters. And these tests, if I'm not mistaken, are testing 2 cluster scenarios. Once we feel good about these, what I think would be great is a test that you can parameterize with the number of clusters.
Yeah.
So that you can say, test this across. Yep, exactly. And you can test the primitives in scenarios where like, there is no reason to think that if it works for 2, it'll work for 3. And if it works for 3, it'll work for 5. So like being able to dial up the number of clusters would be very useful. I don't think we need to dial it to 1,000, but having a parameter, I think, would be very helpful to uncover bugs that only surface at higher numbers of clusters.
Yeah, and Paul, I love that idea. I think, you should be able to parameterize to 1,000, because I think being able to say conform it to 1,000 clusters is a great thing for an implementation to be able to say.
Oh, I mean at first, like we don't need to make a version that goes to 1,000 at first, but
Agreed,
like going
agreed.
to 10, going to 20 would be very useful.
Yeah, yeah. And then the other thing that we should test too is in the opposite direction is the single cluster case. Because one of the neat things I think about MCS is that you can have a single cluster deployment that uses MCS, and then you can easily just add clusters, right? So that's a way to be kind of future-proof from the start. That would be a good thing to probably include here.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like that.
Yep.
Laura.
That makes sense. Oh,
Hi, yes. Just want to double check on, so part of the reason to work on these end-to-end tests in the system that they are and in the definitions that they were in the KEP was because that's a beta blocker. And, if I let this dangle on one more year, then I'll come back as a ghost and haunt SIG MC for the rest of my eternity. But anyways, I just want to confirm the order of operations here. I do agree that the conformance suite may be different. There was a time where we were talking about them conveniently being the same. But either way, I think unless there's some other change to the graduation criteria, updating the current end-to-end test so that they meet the KEP obligations, is it correct? That's still the first priority.
Absolutely.
Yeah, although from my perspective, I think the end-to-end tests we were looking for in the KEP were basically a conformance,
right.
a conformance test, right?
Yeah, so that is kind of the confusing point, and I think maybe it was that they would start out on this demo implementation and then graduate someday or something. But if we're talking about, if we think that the infrastructure is just not shareable between these two things, then I do think we have the opportunity to make the decision of what should those graduation requirements really mean.
Well, the tests, the implementation that was in there now was really just do these resources connect? Can they actually describe an MCS? And then the tests were there just to make sure that it stayed working. And it was just a helper. It was never really an implementation. I'm not sure how much value that baseline implementation that I threw up a while ago really has to the KEP now that there are real implementations. And I'm not sure it's a start over, but I just I think taking those tests and just basically copying them and ripping out the body so that they're testing more what we want is probably more useful at this point than trying to fix that implementation to be something it never was meant to be. That's just kind of my gut, but I'm kind of happy to proceed however. But I think the goal, and anyone please chime in if your understanding is different, but I think the goal of the EDE test that we wanted in the KEP was to basically test that an implementation implemented MCS.
That is my understanding too. And the another little view that I have on this is that the test should make sense if you've only read the spec.
Yes.
So you shouldn't need other knowledge than the spec to read the tests and be like, this makes sense as a test that exercises the spec.
I like the way you put that, Paul. I think that, to me, that is how the tests test the KEP.
Yeah, so that any failure, well, if you take something that supposedly implements the MCS API and it fails to pass the conformance test, the correspondence to some item in the KEP should be obvious.
Yes, exactly. And I don't think it needs to it shouldn't test anything not in the KEP.
Yeah.
At all. And hopefully that makes them relatively light, because we've tried to keep the KEP pretty light. I think there's certainly some, DNS tests. But again, like the test would just be that a pod can see the record that's supposed to be there, for example.
Yeah.
And then,
and that, for example, if the service import has an IP address, the DNS record returns the same IP address.
yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So I think the end-to-end tests as they are today, like it's not like we don't have to like throw them out. I think like the actual like specify steps are still relevant. The like language of the KEP of what they should be able to do in terms of like connectivity and expected endpoints respond, blah, 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 that type of thing is still valid. I think it seems to me that all this like setup that most egregiously has this like, does the service import start part for an implementation, we don't like. And we would rather start earlier in the process and then let the implementation prove its worth, I guess. I think one thing that all of this converges to me is that we should be continuing to develop these end-to-end tests, but against live implementations, and throw out anything that like don't like keep filling in the holes for the demo implementation.
Yes.
And so is it also, so two things about that. One, can we like, should we straight out throw out the demo implementation? Like, has it served its purpose, and is it like noise even just like in the repo? And then also, are we okay therefore that like development on these end-to-end tests like basically requires you to be leveraging some specific implementation to do so?
I think this is a really good question. So first of all, I have no qualms with throwing out the demo implementation if it's not useful.
Okay. Yeah.
I do want to raise the question of, should we have some horrible baseline implementation that honors the spec, that's like written in Bash, that is, human readable but horribly inefficient, whatever it takes? Is there value in something like that, or yeah, do we just say you have to use one of the off-the-shelf implementations, and the tests themselves are the source of truth for expected behavior?
Yeah, like I'll speak just a little bit for Nick, who was working on the end-to-end test one, but he was using the kind clusters, which was sort of like well set up for using this little demo implementation, which was really fast, which he led to because they weren't the tests were too prescriptive compared to the GKE implementation, which is what he had easiest access to run them on. So maybe that's fine, but just like as a example, as a test developer, not having any true perfect example yet, I guess, means that the test basically we write them as the source of truth, and then hopefully something gets to it. Like we don't have like a perfect case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mean
then,
we don't have an implementation that fully implements the spec?
right.
Yeah, I'm not aware of one.
I mean,
Including the demo one at this point. So let's be clear, literally nothing.
Yeah,
The spec to its
so-
entire like specification.
So I think the job of these tests is to tell us the areas where existing implementations aren't complete.
Yeah.
So if we write the correct EDEs and every implementation has some set of failures, that's valuable because it's telling the authors of those implementations what to fix.
Right. And I'll say the other thing that could teach us is if all the implementations have not implemented something in the spec, maybe we should revisit if that thing actually belongs in the spec.
Yeah.
Like if the
Agreed.
implementations are, yeah, I think the two outcomes are A, implementations are lacking. This is important because it will tell the implementation authors that it's time to add that feature, or B, it will tell us that people are finding value without that, and maybe the spec was reaching a little bit too far, and we can just not include the thing that nobody's bothered implementing. Both of these things are valuable, though, and I think it's good signal from the test.
Okay. All right, I
So
think.
yeah,
Oh, go
on the
ahead.
topic of improving, sorry, well, yeah, you go ahead.
No, I think we're probably going to try and converge on the same next. What's the next step?
Okay. Well, so yeah, so on the topic of improving the existing E2E test to be more useful, so I've pushed a few PRs. There's one that says that is a bunch of dependency upgrades, and that leads to this one, which is adding support for Discovery V1 instead of V1 Beta 1, or alongside it. So I did it in a fairly ugly fashion. And so that's something else really that's worth bearing in mind, I think, too, is that the existing end-to-end tests are fairly simple. So if we throw them out, we don't lose much, but at the same time, they are easy to understand and I think easy to extend. But yeah, so there's this one, and so I add support for endpoint slices, and I think I removed a few things as well that weren't all that useful. So there were, for example, it queries the same pod several times, queries the endpoint slices several times, things like that. And so this then at least allows the test to run against clusters that no longer have Discovery V1 Beta 1. And then there's this one where I add creating a service exports. And this allows Submariner to pass the set phase of the test. And then it fails the test itself because both tests rely on having a single cluster set IP, which Submariner doesn't implement.
Mm.
And then, so the next phase in, well, what I'd added to the agenda was I was wondering whether any of the MCS API implementation projects tests could be useful. So the ones I'm familiar with, obviously, are Submariners. And we've got a bunch of, well, what we call discovery, which is really the part that implements MCS more around the DNS side of things, perhaps. But I think some of them, at least, are not Submariner specific and could be reused as a sort of conformance test. So for example, this series here sets up a headless service that's exported and then checks various things about it, like if it can find the pod IPs, if the pod IPs track active pods, and so on and so forth. This one is if you set up a remote service, it can be seen from other clusters. You can resolve, well, it resolves the local service preferentially, so that's Submariner specific. The order doesn't matter. If there are no active pods, you can't resolve the service anymore, etc.
I think, yeah, as long as the licenses are compatible, bring them over. It seems like there's a lot of just.
Yeah, well, it's a CNCF project, so it's.
Yeah, exactly. So,
too, I think.
Given that those tests were basically testing the conformance of Submariner, bring them over, and if anything, hopefully they just match, right? The the spec, and if anything, when we go through it and they don't, that's great signal as well. So yeah,
Yep.
if it's already written, it's great.
Okay.
I'm pro bringing them over. I think the thing to keep an eye on is like, let's make sure that the tests that are in this repo stay true to the spec, in the sense that, not that like I'm not worried about them testing the spec incorrectly. I'm worried about tests that seem useful that
Yeah.
aren't covered by the spec
By the
creeping in.
Yeah. So one practice I've seen for conformance tests is that every single test has to have a pointer to the section of the spec that it's testing.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo. And I think, like Stephen, when you were saying that the test failed, that like, a particular test failed for Submariner due to like single cluster set IP, it made me feel like maybe that test should pass, and maybe a distinct test for single cluster set IP should be failing.
Yeah. So that's
As
what I
an
was thinking as
example
well.
of like,
Yeah. Yeah, we need to split the test. We need to split the tests up so that they're much more granular. Things like if I create a service export, then I see this matching service import. If I query a service that's been exported, I can connect to it. And I don't care what the IP address looks like or whatever at that point in the test. And then there's another test that says I always get the same IP address across all the clusters, and so on.
yeah. I wonder if it would be helpful to just workshop like forget about the test bodies. What tests do we want to have?
Yeah. So
Like just stub tests out to get the right granularity, and then we can fill them in.
yeah, or even just fleshing this issue out.
Yeah, and I'll throw in the chat these tests that I'm referring to, which are this test 1, test 2, test 3, are from this section in the KEP that I just put in the Zoom chat. Whether they are certainly more broad than something like stopping before checking for if there's a cluster IP. It's like way more, it's not that detailed. I will drop this in the notes doc too. Oh yeah, you got it, great. Based on, oh my God, what have I done? None of those. So yeah, so this test plan section, this is where, like, this is the source of truth for me of what we're doing. If this is not what we're doing, then I want to know.
Okay. I think what we're talking about is like, what I'm hearing, though we have not said, is we seem to be kind of like moving toward, let's have finer grain tests so that like failures are fine grain, and you can see, which specific part of the spec wasn't upheld. So, I'm happy to have like a work session about that with folks. I don't think it will take a lot of time to do, but I am hearing we're talking about adjusting the contents of that test plan just a little bit.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, do we want to talk about that now? Do we want to talk about it async? Do we want to talk about a special session?
Well, why don't we just do async offline, and we can probably just spend a little time workshopping the contents of, you know, that test plan together.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it would be really useful to just have a doc where we just basically point form list out, here are the things, here are the simple tests we want. Here's this section of the spec. And then basically the section of the spec can go in the test name, so that failures report it and we can implement those tests. And I think, you know, keeping it simple, like we have the test that checks connectivity. We have the test that makes sure the DNS record points at the right IP, that kind of thing, might be enough. I don't know that we need a huge amount of detail, but just kind of that list so we can make sure it's comprehensive, and then we can go write them. And I expect that the setup part is going to be in line with a lot of stuff we've already written. So hopefully it's not a lot of extra work. And then it's really just going to be all the cases, you know, checking to make sure the records are correct, that the endpoint slices exist with the right IPs, that kind of thing.
Agree.
Okay, well, that's all I had.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and Stephen and Laura, thank you both for, you know, maintaining the attention on the conformance test. This was a quality conversation that we had today.
Yeah, this was awesome. It's really nice to see, and that website is looking great. It's cool to have some real content. So, great meeting.
It is.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Pat yourselves on the back, everybody. Have a great rest of your day too.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, bye.
All right.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. See ya.